Hi everyone. So today I'm going to break the ice and talk about the Epstein File and the connection to society. And also, obviously, it is such one of the biggest cases in all world history and quite a sensitive topic. There's so many people that are angry, and there's, so much justice that has been needed for victims, and there's just so much speculation surrounding the Epstein File that I think it's a really good time to throw in some perspective for people to understand so that the world can heal and upgrade from such a tumultuous case. It's huge. It's such a mixed bag, and there's so much that has been exposed in the Epstein File that quite really displays and shows quite a unique understanding behind just policies, really, infrastructures, and then also how important the law is. One thing that is prevalent and also a big part of the infrastructure of history, really, comes down to legalised prostitution. And, countries like countries like England and Australia, we actually have legalised prostitution, and it's one of the oldest professions of all time. And the safeguard that these kinds of laws have really sits around the difference between exploitation and then obviously the difference between choice when it comes to having sexual intercourse, not only personally, which is, a different bag and different story, but definitely when it connects to finances. And the law protects that. And because there's a lot of people that, don't mind doing something like that for finances, and then there's a lot of people that wouldn't do that for finances, and that's what choice and freedom actually holds. When it comes to the USA, the law failed this circumstance just because the chances of the Epstein File even existing, if they had legalised prostitution in the USA, is next to nil, really, because, when it comes to a service like that, it is the speculation and understanding behind human nature that I feel that a lot of the reason why Epstein was so secretive and why he created such a manipulated format of, servicing and convincing and things was because in the USA, if you're over 18, the chances of you wanting to get into prostitution, knowing that it's not legal, are much higher than the convincing act behind a younger person. The convincing act behind a younger person doing it unknowingly, and also more likely to have a ability to be groomed or persuaded. And I suppose that seems to be in the human nature format. What humans need is to be serviced emotionally, environmentally, from a sensory perspective. It's animalistic, and it is one of those things that I believe that had nothing to do with the age of those girls. It had everything to do with the availability, accessibility, easeability, and ability to manipulate, and also the ability to have access. And the chances of it coming out, well, I suppose the chances of it coming out the way that it did was a bit ignorant when it come to the group around whoever thought that it was a good idea, just because people grow up and they realise. But when I suppose you're in it, it's something that you would think perhaps wouldn't be an issue. One thing Epstein did was he committed suicide, or allegedly. Well, no, he committed suicide. He died in jail. And to think that you got to think of the man of who would be in that situation and his reasoning. And I suppose he had no way out. But I really do feel as though if the law in the USA supported prostitution, the accessibility of what he was doing, it wouldn't even be half an issue. And I suppose that what comes in the USA as a learning curve, because Vegas seems to be the only place, you know, is it Sin City, where you can, well, it's not really a sin, you know, to pay, or it is a sin in the USA, but it's not a sin, you know. At the end of the day, choice matters. And the people that are in that industry, you know, it takes a lot, and it also is part of their lifestyle, and it isn't really something that you can really look too down on. You know, the openness of prostitution in society actually relieves and ensures and brings an infrastructure that protects young women and young men from sexual violence. It also protects in relationships from sexual violence, and also is part of an infrastructure in the world that is needed. You know, it's a huge part. It also is one of those things that creates an income, a freedom. It is a liberation and an empowerment type of job. And it definitely comes down to choice. It has nothing to do with anything other than that. And there is no professionalism or legitimacy behind that profession being any other way. And it also prevents human exploitation. It also is those licenses and those legalised areas also create a safe barrier for human trafficking, and also a safe barrier in society that creates a space of economic balance. And, you know, it really is one of those things. Unfortunately, with the Epstein File, it really did expose a lot, because one thing about migration, and one thing that I know that one of the girls actually said, that at the time, I think she had come and migrated from South America, and she was young, and this is also something that was exposed in the P. Diddy case as well, and not the case itself, but in the build-up to the case, there was so much around the younger generation and sexual intercourse, and also has been brought up massively if we make it even bigger and understand the infrastructure and how alike everything is, comes down to the rules and the knowings behind Sharia, you know, around Sharia law, and the connection to sexual violence and choice, and then also the understanding around consciousness. One thing to be sure and to understand, and this was exposed during, you know, the release of the Epstein Files, was one of the girls actually did not realise that what she was doing was illegal, and kind of, you know, the law in the USA, you know, did obviously connect it that way, especially because there were so many girls, and she must have been educated during the process trying to battle with that, and actually ended up, you know, being part of the group that pressed charges. And this is what it comes down to, you know, when Sharia law, you know, is one of those things in society. When you look it up and you actually learn about the written part, and they're the only, you know, Islam and Islamic religion are one of the only religions that have ever had that in their law-abiding areas, of something that they had the guts to even write down. And it really does come down to, you know, what age people choose to do something like that, and also the reflection as an adult to ensure that, you know, what the law actually does. You know, sexual violence and rape, you know, you obviously need consent, but you also have the availability to be able to choose and know and understand your circumstances around something like that, especially if it's something that you did when you were younger. What came out in the P. Diddy case as well was young girls wanting to be around rock stars and perform sexual, have sex with these guys. And they enjoyed it, you know, in their younger days. You kind of wonder whether or not when they get older, how they're going to think or feel about it. But they are conscious young people. And we're talking about people around, you know, 13 years old. And, you know, the girl that was in the interview, you know, didn't have a sexual encounter with P. Diddy himself, but was part of the crew and the group in terms of being part of these parties. And there was a girl also in the Epstein File that was also the same and was, from South America. So it really is one of those things that comes down to culture, being conservative, the eyes of the law, and also the legitimacy around choice. One thing that we have in society is a massive multiculturalism, big infrastructure and ecosystem that has exposed this part and is exposing this part. So this is why it's so important. It's so important to have consent. It's also so important to have education and understanding behind the performance of a sexual act. It also is so important to have a legalised infrastructure of prostitution where people have the choice to work in that industry. And then also what that funds and what that brings is another infrastructure that also connects to the defense against human exploitation. And because there's nowhere to go, if you want to sleep with somebody, you go into a brothel and you pay for that service and you get to choose who you want to be with, male or female. And the sex industry is huge for that reason, and also something to be respected, just because the real backbone of it all just has so much for society and just so much freedom overall. And that's what it really comes down to. At the end of the day, the law needs to prevail, and also society needs to understand that when something like this happens and when something like this is exposed, it really does come down to not only understanding people behind the act and also understanding their drive and reasoning, but also understanding what was in the way for it to be something else and something better. And that's what has been exposed massively, not only during the Epstein case and file, but also connected to the P. Diddy case and file as well. And it's just something that the USA, I'm sure will change. I'm sure it will bring a new upgraded system over time where they will be able to understand and see this part, and for all countries in the world to really understand this perspective, just because it's legitimate. And I really do feel like USA not having that as a legalised part in their country was a real big driver for that whole case existing in the first place. So thanks for listening. It is a perspective that I believe needed to be shared. And if you have any perspective questions or anything like that, please don't hesitate to ask. But just always remember, choice matters, and the law matters, and availability matters, and what that represents and funds matters as well. So it's just such an important thing to find and understand and have respect, not only for the sex industry, but also, for our bodies and our choices, and understand migration. So it is such a sensitive topic, especially when people are much younger. But I you don't really think about it too much. But growing up, I knew girls that were doing things like that, in year 7, and we would have been 13, and I was like gobsmacked. It was something for me, growing up in a more conservative culture was something that, I did much later, and almost as an adult. So, but that's multiculturalism, and that's also a real unique understanding around not only the choice to do that, but also the mentality around what you think about something like that. When I was 13, we were kissing boys and, doing it was completely a much lighter and a younger type of innocence, but that's not where everybody was at that age. And it is something that needs awareness, needs education, needs especially sex education, and also cultural understanding around one thing that we are protected for around worldwide is the laws surrounding rape are quite consistent in most countries, and the law does protect that part. In all countries, actually, the law does protect that part. And it is something that is choice-driven and one of those hard things to prove, I suppose, and it is a battle But not only is rape wrong, it is one of the wrong, it's so wrong. If somebody says no, then there's so much option, people don't need to go through that kind of thing. There's an option somewhere else. So it's like, well, where's the access and the availability for that to even be happening? You've got so much choice in this world, and you've even got free choices as well. There's so many dating sites, and you don't have to do something like that. People don't have to be going through something like that. There's just so much availability, and it's just important that availability and access is around and available and accessible to protect men and women from going through those kinds of things. So the freedom and access matters, and freedom will prevail in that way. Freedom is so important, and accessibility in legalised areas around these topics is so important, because that does remove those and sifts through the difference between the animalistic male or the hungry female, and also the medical issues and sickening parts of society that are doing those kinds of things for more I don't want to call it sadistic too much. I'd definitely call it medical reasons, that where it sits a little bit more, it's not part of the infrastructure of devil worship. It's deeper than that. It's more hidden and secret, and in the inner workings of a troubled person. So it's important to also understand the differences between that, and also get down to the bottom to eradicate this issue. There's so much option to do so, and also so many flags to be able to identify the wrongs and rights of society. And I think the more the sex industry or the act of sex is plagued by these circumstances, I think the harder it will be to eradicate these issues and diminish these problems. It really does sit in our infrastructures, laws, policies and ideas, and also the way that we actually view the industry. I've worked in the hair and beauty industry, and also obviously studied between being a life coach and a Reiki master teacher, and then dealing and knowing with people my whole life, through my whole entire career, meeting so many different walks of life. This kind of thing, it doesn't have factors, whereas in society it has so many factors. There's so much controversy, propaganda, ideologies, cultural differences and issues and things like that. And it really does need that freedom, that breath, that society approval that's going to allow everybody to have freedom when it comes to opening the doors of accessibility for these types of things, because that's what the world needs. And then what we can see afterwards will be the real difference between problems in society. But when these things have become problems, it's problems with the ecosystem and infrastructure. When infrastructures are correct, then you have a problem with what we really need to be worried about, which sits 100% in medical, and it's all in the underworkings of these infrastructures. So opening doors and undoing the locks and giving these spaces freedom prevails for all. So please understand, what we're going through at the moment is an awareness, awareness when it comes to what mass migration actually is, awareness around these subjects, and also awareness of culture and perspective and law, and also the extreme parts of society that this is where awareness matters. This is where perspective matters. The only people that have answers to this stuff and a healthy perspective, the ones that have gone through it themselves. And that's what we need. We need people that have wisdom, life experience, have grown up and been able to have a conditioned part of their understanding around these subjects, so that we can understand better. One thing when we talk about God, and we also talk about the gift of life and also the human body, the human body gets prepared for children from as young as 9 years old to 10 years old. And we also have a big issue when it comes to young people having sexual intercourse, and that's a society conservative and conditioning area. And it's not to say it's right or wrong, you know, it's something that, you know, being a little bit older myself, and I can use myself as an example, I feel happy that, you know, was something that I didn't experience until my, you know, mid to late teens. But I do know people that did experience that much younger, and it is one of those things that does come down to their perspective, because we do have that one side of our biology and religion that we're conditioned from early to be able to, you know, bear children, and you can't bear children without sexual intercourse. And then we've got society, and then we've also got, you know, the whole plethora of reasoning that sits between all of that, and then the understandings and the law and the protective elements of those things, and then obviously the sex trade and the legalities around that kind of thing. So there is a huge awareness and opening to this now, more than there ever has been in history, and understandings, data, and then also these stories and also these cases, you know, which expose and all ends and sides of things. So it is definitely something that needs discussion, and definitely something that needs awareness. And then obviously that's where Sharia law comes in, because it does come down to honouring that conscious decision that all cultures do. Our law actually conditions and has an area for that, and then it also has an area to create stoppages where it's recognised as something else. So it's a big subject, huge subject, and sensitive subject as well. But definitely something that has been released, and awareness has been created around this. So I think it's a very important subject. So something not to take lightly, but something to understand, you know, the gift of life, and, you know, God's gifted, or the, you know, if you don't believe in God, you know, the biological respect that sits behind the human body and its abilities. And at what age. So it's important. Thanks for listening.